The autumn wind carried whispers of change across the Rio Grande Valley as Samuel Macready guided his weathered sorrel mare along the rocky riverbank. The year was 1873, and the frontier territories of New Mexico stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in shades of copper and gold. Samuel had spent the better part of his 42 years learning to read the signs that nature offered freely to those willing to listen. Today, something felt different. His calloused hands gripped the leather reins with practiced ease as he surveyed the landscape before him. The cottonwood trees stood like ancient sentinels along the water's edge, their leaves rustling secrets that only the wind could understand. Samuel had been tracking a small band of wild horses for 3 days, following their hoofprints across the harsh terrain that stretched between the settlements of Las Cruces and the Apache territories beyond. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the red earth that spoke of countless stories written in dust and stone. Samuel's keen eyes, weathered by years of squinting against the desert sun, caught sight of something unusual near a bend in the river where the water pooled in a natural basin surrounded by smooth boulders. At first, he thought it might be a deer drinking from the stream, but as his mare picked her way carefully down the embankment, Samuel realized he was looking at something far more unexpected. A small figure sat motionless by the water's edge, so still that it seemed to be part of the landscape itself. Samuel brought his horse to a quiet halt, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the worn grip of his Colt revolver. In this territory, caution was not merely advisable, it was essential for survival. The Apache had been increasingly active in recent months, and tensions between the various tribes and the encroaching settlers had reached a dangerous crescendo. The figure by the river had not moved, seemingly unaware of his presence. Samuel studied the scene carefully, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The person appeared to be a child, sitting with their back to him, facing the flowing water. Dark hair hung in tangled waves past narrow shoulders, and the clothing appeared to be traditional Apache garments, though worn and dirt-stained. Samuel dismounted slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He tied his mare's reins to a sturdy mesquite bush and approached on foot, each step calculated and deliberate. The child still had not acknowledged his presence, remaining as motionless as the stones that lined the riverbank. As he drew closer, Samuel could see that the figure was indeed a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Her skin was bronzed by the sun, and her clothing consisted of a simple buckskin dress that had seen better days. More concerning was her condition. She appeared thin, almost gaunt, and her bare feet showed signs of having traveled long distances over rough terrain. "Hello there," Samuel called out softly, speaking in the Apache tongue he had learned during his years trading with various tribal groups. His voice carried the respect and caution that experience had taught him was necessary when encountering anyone in this vast and often dangerous territory. The girl did not respond. She continued to stare at the flowing water, her posture suggesting neither fear nor awareness of his presence. Samuel moved closer, noting that her breathing was shallow but steady. When he was close enough to see her profile, he was struck by the profound stillness in her dark eyes, not the alertness he would expect from an Apache child, but something deeper and more troubling. "Little one, can you hear me?" Samuel tried again, this time in English, then repeated the question in what Spanish he knew. Still no response. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the water, as if she were seeing something there that existed beyond the physical world. Samuel crouched down several feet away from her, maintaining a respectful distance while studying her more closely. Her face was thin, with high cheekbones and features that spoke of pure Apache heritage. But there was something else in her expression, or rather, the complete absence of expression, that troubled him deeply. The experienced frontiersman had encountered trauma before. He had seen what violence and loss could do to the human spirit, how it could leave marks that were invisible to the eye, but devastating to the soul. This child bore all the signs of someone who had witnessed horrors that no young person should ever have to endure. Samuel noticed other details that painted a grim picture. The girl's dress, while traditional in style, was torn in several places and stained with what appeared to be dried blood, though whether it was her own or someone else's, he could not tell. Her hands, resting limply in her lap, showed scratches and cuts that suggested she had been traveling through rough country for some time. More troubling still was the complete absence of any personal effects. No water vessel, no food, no blanket or tools, nothing that would be necessary for survival in this harsh landscape. It was as if she had simply appeared by the river, cut off from everything that had once anchored her to the world. Samuel remained crouched in the gravel, watching the girl and considering his options. The sun was climbing higher and the temperature was beginning to rise. Soon, the desert heat would become punishing, and this child, in her current condition, would not survive long without shelter, food, and water. He thought about the settlements he knew, the military outposts and trading posts scattered across the territory. Many of them were not friendly to Apache people, especially in light of recent conflicts. But he also thought about the Apache bands he had encountered over the years, the families and communities that might be missing this young girl. The problem was that the territory was vast, and the various Apache groups moved frequently, following seasonal patterns and avoiding areas where tensions with settlers and soldiers had grown too dangerous. Finding this girl's people could take weeks or months, if it was possible at all. As these thoughts turned in his mind, Samuel noticed something that made his heart sink. In the soft sand near the water's edge, he could see the faint impressions of many footprints, not just the girl's small bare feet, but larger prints as well. The pattern told a story that he had seen too many times before. A hurried departure, people running, the chaos that came with violence and terror. Following the trail back with his eyes, Samuel could see disturbed earth and broken vegetation that suggested a larger group had passed this way recently. The signs were subtle, but unmistakable to someone with his experience tracking both animals and people across the wilderness. The girl by the river was not simply lost. She was likely the sole survivor of something terrible. Samuel rose slowly, his knees protesting after years of hard living on the frontier. He walked back to his horse, moving quietly so as not to startle the child, and retrieved his water canteen and a thick woolen blanket from his saddlebags. The blanket was one of his most prized possessions, woven by his late wife Martha from wool they had raised on their small ranch outside of Santa Fe. It had kept him warm through countless cold desert nights, and its deep blue color had faded to a soft gray blue that reminded him of morning skies. When he returned to the riverside, the girl had not moved. Samuel sat down on a flat boulder about 6 feet away from her and placed the canteen and blanket beside him. He had learned that patience was often the most important tool when dealing with traumatized people, whether they were Apache, Mexican, or Anglo settlers who had survived Indian raids or other frontier violence. "I have water here," Samuel said quietly in Apache, then repeated it in English. "And something to keep you warm." The girl's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward him, the first sign that she was aware of his presence. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but to Samuel it represented a crack in the wall of shock and trauma that seemed to surround her like invisible armor. He uncapped the canteen and took a small sip himself, then set it down closer to where she sat. In a territory where water could mean the difference between life and death, sharing it was a universal gesture of goodwill and trust. Minutes passed in silence. The sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled on the thermal currents that rose from the heated rocks. Samuel had hunted and trapped in these lands for years, but he had never experienced silence quite like this. Not empty silence, but something heavy with unspoken pain and loss. Finally, the girl's hand moved. It was a small gesture, barely more than a twitch of her fingers, but she reached toward the canteen. Samuel remained perfectly still as she lifted it with trembling hands and brought it to her lips. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin and onto her torn dress, as if she had not tasted liquid in days. When she finished drinking, she set the canteen down carefully and returned to her previous position, staring at the flowing water. But something had changed. The rigid stillness was replaced by something softer, as if the simple act of accepting help had begun to restore some small part of her humanity. Samuel waited another few minutes before speaking again. "My name is Samuel Macready," he said in Apache, his pronunciation careful and respectful. "I live in a cabin about half a day's ride from here, near the old trading post." The girl's head turned slightly in his direction, the first time she had looked directly at him. Her eyes were large and dark, filled with an intelligence that the trauma had not been able to extinguish entirely. There was recognition there, as if she understood his words but had forgotten how to respond to them. "You don't have to tell me your name," Samuel continued gently. "Not until you're ready, but I can't leave you here alone." The statement hung in the air between them like morning mist over the river. Samuel meant it sincerely. His conscience would not allow him to abandon a child in the wilderness, regardless of the complications that helping her might bring. The frontier was a place where people looked out for one another when circumstances demanded it, and this was clearly one of those times. The girl's gaze returned to the water, but Samuel could sense that she was listening to his words, processing them in whatever way her traumatized mind was capable of handling. He decided to give her more time and information, hoping that patience might succeed where pressure would certainly fail. "I was married once," Samuel said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a story rather than trying to persuade or convince. "My wife Martha and I had a small ranch where we raised sheep and horses. She died of fever 3 winters ago, and I've been living alone since then. It's not a bad life, but it gets lonely sometimes." He paused, watching the girl's profile for any sign that his words were having an effect. Her breathing seemed to have become more regular, less shallow and panicked than it had been when he first found her. "Martha always said that the Apache people were the finest horsemen she had ever seen," Samuel continued. "She had great respect for your people, for the way you could live in harmony with this hard land. She would have been honored to help someone like you." The mention of his wife's opinion seemed to strike a chord with the girl. Her head tilted slightly, and for just a moment, Samuel thought he saw the ghost of what might once have been curiosity in her eyes. It was another small crack in the wall of trauma, and he felt a surge of hope. The sun was now high enough that the shadows had shortened considerably, and the temperature was beginning to rise toward the punishing heat that characterized desert afternoons. Samuel knew that they could not remain by the river much longer without risking dehydration and heat exhaustion, particularly given the girl's already weakened condition. He stood up slowly and unfolded the wool blanket, shaking out the dust and debris that had accumulated during his travels. The fabric was soft and well worn, comfortable against the skin even in warm weather. Martha had made it large enough to serve as both a bedroll and a covering, and it had saved Samuel from freezing during many cold nights on the trail. "This belonged to my wife," Samuel said as he held up the blanket. "She would want you to have it." He approached the girl slowly, telegraphed his intentions clearly so as not to frighten her. When he was close enough, he gently draped the blanket around her shoulders, being careful not to touch her directly or move too quickly. The response was immediate and profound. The girl's entire body seemed to relax, as if the warmth and softness of the wool had reminded her of safety and comfort she had nearly forgotten. Her hands came up to clutch the edges of the blanket, pulling it more tightly around herself. For the first time since Samuel had found her, tears began to flow down the girl's cheeks. They came slowly at first, then more freely, as if a dam had finally broken inside her. She made no sound, but the tears spoke volumes about the pain and loss she had been carrying. Samuel crouched beside her again, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to respect her space. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe now. Whatever happened before, you're safe now." The girl continued to cry silently, her thin shoulders shaking beneath the wool blanket. Samuel remained with her, offering his presence as the only gift he could give at that moment. He had learned from his own experiences with loss and grief that sometimes the most healing thing was simply to have someone witness your pain without trying to fix it or explain it away. As the morning progressed toward midday, the girl's tears gradually subsided. She wiped her face with the edge of the blanket, and when she looked at Samuel again, there was something different in her expression. Not happiness or trust exactly, but a kind of recognition that he meant her no harm. "Are you hungry?" Samuel asked, reaching into his saddlebags for some dried meat and hardtack biscuits he carried for long rides. The girl nodded slightly, the first clear communication she had offered since he found her. He handed her small portions of food, watching as she ate slowly and carefully. Her manners were good, he noticed. She had been raised properly, taught to be grateful for food and not to waste it. This told him something about her family and upbringing, suggesting that she came from a stable, traditional Apache household. As she ate, Samuel found himself wondering about her story. What had happened to her family? Where had they been traveling? And what had gone wrong? The questions burned in his mind, but he knew better than to ask them directly. Trauma had its own timeline, and pushing for information before she was ready to share it would likely cause her to withdraw again. Instead, he focused on immediate practical concerns. The desert was no place for a child to survive alone, and while his cabin was not luxurious, it offered shelter, safety, and the basic necessities of life. He had supplies stored away, enough to care for both of them through the coming winter months, but taking in an Apache child would not be without complications. The territorial authorities were still officially at war with several Apache bands, and harboring what they might consider an enemy could bring serious legal troubles. More concerning were his neighbors. Some of them had lost family members in Apache raids and would not look kindly on his decision to help this girl. On the other hand, Samuel had also seen the devastating effects of military campaigns against Apache villages, the indiscriminate violence that had claimed the lives of women and children along with warriors. He had witnessed the aftermath of massacres that had left entire families destroyed, and he suspected that this girl might be a survivor of one such encounter. The more he considered the situation, the more convinced he became that his course of action was clear. Whatever the complications or dangers, he could not abandon this child to die alone in the wilderness. Martha would never have forgiven him, and more importantly, he would never be able to forgive himself. "Listen to me," Samuel said when the girl had finished eating. "I'm going to take you to my cabin. You'll be safe there, and we can figure out what comes next once you've had time to rest and recover your strength." The girl looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that conveyed agreement. Samuel helped her to her feet, noting how unsteady she was after sitting in one position for so long. The blanket remained wrapped around her shoulders like a protective cocoon, and she clutched it tightly as if it were her only anchor to safety in a world that had become incomprehensibly dangerous. Leading his horse by the reins, Samuel began the slow journey away from the river. The girl walked beside him, her bare feet moving carefully over the rocky ground. She still had not spoken a word, but her willingness to leave the riverside with him represented a significant act of trust. As they climbed up from the river valley, Samuel caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, a thin column of smoke was rising into the clear desert air. It was too straight and too persistent to be a natural fire, and its location corresponded roughly with the area where he had seen signs of the larger group's passage. Samuel quickened their pace without explanation, his eyes fixed on that ominous pillar of smoke. Whatever had happened to this girl's people might still be happening, and he needed to get her as far away from the area as possible before whoever was responsible decided to expand their search. The girl seemed to sense his urgency, though she could not see the smoke from her position. She moved more quickly despite her obvious exhaustion, matching his pace with a determination that spoke of survival instincts honed by recent necessity. They traveled for nearly an hour before Samuel allowed himself to look back. The smoke column was still visible, but more distant now, and he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Whatever tragedy had befallen this girl's family, at least he had managed to get her away from immediate danger. As they walked, Samuel found himself studying his unexpected companion more closely. Despite her traumatized state, there were signs of the person she had been before whatever terrible thing had happened to her. Her posture, when she forgot to be afraid, showed the natural grace that came from a life spent in harmony with the natural world. Her eyes, though currently filled with pain, held intelligence and strength. Most importantly, she had survived. Whatever had happened to her family, whatever violence and chaos she had witnessed, she had found the strength and will to keep living. That spoke of a spirit that, while damaged, was not broken beyond repair. Samuel's cabin came into view as they crested a low hill overlooking a valley where a seasonal creek ran through stands of cottonwood and willow. The structure was modest but solid, built from logs and chinked with adobe mud in the traditional frontier style. A small corral held his other horses, and a vegetable garden showed the results of his attempts at self-sufficiency. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. Samuel had banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it had apparently kept burning in his absence. The sight of that welcoming smoke seemed to affect the girl profoundly. Her step quickened, and for the first time since he had found her, Samuel saw something that might have been hope cross her features. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as they approached the cabin. Samuel realized with surprise that the entire day had passed since he first spotted the girl by the river. Time had taken on a different quality in her presence, as if her trauma had slowed the world around them to match the careful pace of her healing. As they reached the porch steps, the girl stopped suddenly and looked back in the direction they had come from. Samuel followed her gaze and saw that the smoke column was no longer visible in the distance. Either the fire had burned out, or they had traveled far enough that the intervening hills blocked their view. The girl turned back toward the cabin, and Samuel thought he saw her shoulders relax slightly. Whatever that smoke had represented, putting distance between herself and its source seemed to provide some measure of comfort. Samuel opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. She hesitated on the threshold, her eyes taking in the interior of the cabin with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust in closed spaces. But after a moment, she stepped inside, still wrapped in Martha's blanket. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with embers still glowing on the hearth. A wooden table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and a bed was built into an alcove near the back wall. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, supplies, and the various tools and implements necessary for frontier life. The girl's eyes moved over everything, cataloging details with the thoroughness of someone whose survival might depend on understanding her environment. Samuel noticed that she paid particular attention to the windows and the door. Potential escape routes, he realized. Her wariness was well-founded and would serve her well in a world that had proven itself dangerous beyond measure. "This is home," Samuel said simply. "Not much to look at, but it's solid and safe." The girl nodded slightly, still not speaking but seeming to accept his assessment. She moved to a chair near the fireplace and sat down carefully, arranging the blanket around herself with unconscious precision. Samuel busied himself with practical matters, stoking the fire, lighting an oil lamp as the daylight began to fade, and preparing a simple meal from his stored supplies. As he worked, he found himself glancing frequently at his guest, still hardly able to believe the circumstances that had brought her into his life. The girl watched his movements with alert attention, and Samuel was struck again by her intelligence. Despite her traumatized state, she was learning about him and his routines, filing away information that might prove useful later. It was behavior that spoke of good survival instincts and proper training. As evening approached and Samuel prepared to serve their meal, he realized that he had been thinking of the girl as exactly that, the girl, without any more personal designation. She had not told him her name, and he had not wanted to pressure her for information she was not ready to share. But as he watched her sitting by his fireplace, wrapped in his wife's blanket and slowly beginning to show signs of feeling safe, Samuel found himself thinking that she needed more than just the impersonal designation of the girl. She needed a name, something to anchor her identity as she began the long process of healing from whatever trauma had brought her to that riverside. The name that came to him seemed to arise from somewhere deep in his memory, perhaps from one of the Apache trading partners he had known over the years. Ayanna, he said softly, testing the sound of it in the quiet cabin. The girl looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his for the first time with something approaching directness. There was surprise in her expression and something else, recognition perhaps, or simply an appreciation for being seen as an individual rather than a problem to be solved. Ayanna, Samuel repeated. It means eternal blossom in your language, doesn't it? It seems like a good name for someone who has survived what you've survived. The girl, Ayanna, continued to look at him, and Samuel thought he saw the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corners of her mouth. It was gone almost immediately, but it had been there, a sign that somewhere beneath the trauma and loss, the person she had been was still alive. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside, Samuel served their evening meal and settled down to eat across the table from his unexpected guest. The silence between them was no longer heavy with pain and fear, but had taken on a different quality, still careful and fragile, but touched with the possibility of something more. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, or what challenges they would face as news of an Apache child living in Samuel's cabin inevitably spread through the territorial settlements. But for tonight, they had shelter, food, and safety. For tonight, it was enough. Outside, the desert wind carried new scents and sounds across the valley, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with all its uncertainties and possibilities. But inside the cabin, by the light of the oil lamp and the warmth of the fire, two survivors of very different tragedies had found each other, and perhaps the beginning of hope.